I've been carrying this story around for years, and lately it's been sitting heavier than usual. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's the fact that sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. and remember the exact moment I decided someone else's life was worth less than my freedom. For context, my name's William. I'm in my 40s now, have a regular job, a decent apartment, and a life that looks completely ordinary from the outside. If you met me at a bar, you'd probably assume I'm just another quiet guy who works too much and complains about rent. You wouldn't think, that guy once lied in court and destroyed a man's life to save his own. But that's exactly what happened. This goes back about 15 years, when I was 26 and making a long series of bad decisions. I was broke most of the time, hanging around the wrong people, doing little things that felt harmless in the moment but added up quickly. Nothing huge at first, mostly shady side hustles and being present when things crossed lines they shouldn't have. The night everything started unraveling was a stupid one. A bar, too much whiskey, and a fight that escalated faster than anyone expected. Someone got hurt badly. Suddenly police were involved. Statements were taken. Names were written down. Mine included. At first I thought it would blow over. I wasn't the one who threw the worst punch, and I definitely wasn't the one who caused the injury that put the guy in the hospital. But the problem was I had been right there when it happened. Close enough that the police decided I wasn't just a witness, I was part of it. A few weeks later I learned something that made my stomach drop. Prosecutors were considering charges against several of us. Serious ones. The kind that could ruin your 20s and probably most of your 30s too. That's when the idea first appeared. Not fully formed. Not like some movie villain plan. Just a quiet thought in the back of my mind. If the story changes, maybe I walk away. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself I'd just tell the truth and hope for the best. But the closer the court date got, the more I realized something brutal about the situation. The truth might send me to prison. And a lie, if people believed it, might save me. The worst part? There was already someone the blame could fall on. The worst thing about what I did is how easy the choice became once fear really settled in. When the police first interviewed us, there were 6 people connected to that night. Most of us barely knew each other. Typical bar crowd that got pulled into the same mess. But one guy stood out, Daniel. Quiet, awkward, the kind of guy who looked nervous even when nothing was happening. And more importantly, he had already argued with the victim earlier that evening. At the time, it didn't mean much. People argue in bars all the time. But once lawyers got involved, that detail suddenly looked different. Motive, they called it. My lawyer never told me to lie. He was careful with his words. But during one meeting he said something that stuck in my head. If the jury believes someone else started it, you become a witness instead of a defendant. That sentence lived in my brain for days. Daniel had been drinking heavily. His memory of the night was fuzzy, according to police reports. And nobody seemed particularly close to him. Which meant something terrible. If the story tilted slightly, it might land entirely on him. At first I kept telling myself I wasn't actually going to do it. Thinking about a lie and committing to one are two very different things. At least that's what I told myself while the court date kept creeping closer. But fear has a strange way of reorganizing your morals. Every time I imagined the worst-case scenario, prison, a record, my family finding out what I'd gotten involved in, the same thought kept returning: there might be a way out. Not a clean one. Not an honest one. But a way. So I started replaying the night in my head over and over again. Every detail. Who stood where? Who said what? Which parts were clear and which parts were chaotic? That's when I realized something important. Most of the fight had happened in a blur. Loud music, people shouting, chairs moving. Half the bar probably couldn't confidently describe what happened in those 30 seconds. Memory is fragile. Especially after alcohol. And if memory is fragile, then testimony can be shaped. That's the moment the idea stopped being a thought and started becoming a plan. Once the idea settled in my head, I started doing something that still makes me uncomfortable to admit. I rehearsed. Not like in a movie where someone practices speeches in the mirror. It was quieter than that. More calculated. I wrote down everything I remembered about that night, the bar layout, who arrived first, where people were standing when the shouting started. Then I slowly began adjusting small pieces of the story. Nothing dramatic. Just subtle shifts that made Daniel look more central to the conflict. Instead of, Daniel argued earlier, it became, Daniel seemed angry most of the night. Instead of, the punch came out of nowhere. It became, I saw Daniel move toward him first. Tiny changes. But together they built a narrative. I also paid attention to what others had already told police. The reports weren't identical. People disagreed on details. That helped me sleep at night. If everyone's memory was already messy, then my version wouldn't stand out too much. At least that's what I convinced myself. Deep down, though, I knew I wasn't just remembering anymore. I was constructing. The strange thing about lies is that the first time you say them out loud is the hardest. After that, they start feeling disturbingly normal. My first real test came during a follow-up meeting with my lawyer. He asked me to walk through the night again, slowly, like we were reconstructing a timeline. Up until that moment, the plan had lived entirely in my head. I could still back out. I could still just tell the truth and deal with whatever happened. Instead, when we got to the moment the fight started, I paused and made the choice. I remember Daniel stepping forward first, I said. The words felt heavy leaving my mouth. My lawyer leaned back slightly, thinking. You're sure about that? That question hung in the air longer than it should have. For a split second I considered correcting myself. But fear pushed harder than guilt. Yeah, I said, nodding. I'm pretty sure. He wrote it down. And just like that, the lie officially existed outside my head. After that meeting, something shifted inside me. The line had already been crossed, so my brain started focusing on one thing, making the story believable. I realized quickly that a good lie can't be perfect. Perfect stories sound rehearsed. Real memories are messy, people hesitate, forget small details, correct themselves. So I practiced doing exactly that. When I went over the story in my head, I deliberately left gaps. I'd pause at certain points, like I was trying to remember. I even added a few harmless uncertainties. I think he said something first. I might be wrong, but it looked like Daniel shoved him. Those little hesitations made the rest of the story sound more natural. I also replayed the bar's layout again and again. The pool table near the wall. The sticky floor. The neon beer signs glowing behind the counter. The more real the environment felt, the easier it became to slide my version of events into it. Still, every time I thought about the courtroom, my stomach tightened. Because rehearsing alone was one thing. Saying it under oath would be something else entirely. The morning of the trial felt unreal, like I was watching someone else walk through my life. I remember standing outside the courthouse with a paper cup of terrible coffee, staring at the entrance doors. People were moving in and out like it was just another Tuesday for them. Lawyers with briefcases, security guards chatting, someone laughing on their phone. Meanwhile, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Inside, everything smelled like old paper and cleaning products. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, but somehow that made it worse. Every chair, every desk felt close enough that nothing could be hidden. Then I saw Daniel. He was sitting at the defense table, wearing a suit that looked slightly too big for him. His hair was neatly combed, and he kept rubbing his hands together like he was cold. For a moment our eyes met. He gave a small nod, the kind strangers give each other when they recognize a familiar face in an unfamiliar place. And that simple gesture made something twist in my stomach. Because he clearly had no idea what I was about to say. When they finally called my name, my legs felt heavier than they should have. It's strange how something as simple as walking a few steps to a chair can suddenly feel like crossing a battlefield. I sat down, raised my hand, and swore to tell the truth. That moment still sticks with me. Saying those words while knowing exactly what I planned to do felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump anyway. The prosecutor started with easy questions: my name, where I worked, how I ended up at the bar that night. Basic stuff. My voice sounded calmer than I expected, which almost scared me more than if I'd been nervous. Then we reached the part I'd rehearsed. What did you see when the fight began? The courtroom went quiet. I could feel people watching, the judge, the lawyers, even Daniel somewhere behind me. I took a breath, just like I'd practiced. And then I told the story I had built. The one where Daniel started everything. Once I started talking, something strange happened. The lie flowed easier than I expected. I described the argument earlier in the evening, how Daniel had seemed irritated and kept raising his voice. That part wasn't entirely false, which made the rest easier to build around it. I explained where everyone was standing and how the tension in the room had been growing. Then I arrived at the moment that mattered most. I saw Daniel move toward him first, I said carefully. It looked like he shoved him. The prosecutor asked me to clarify. I repeated it, adding small details, how the victim stumbled slightly, how people nearby reacted. None of it was dramatic. Just believable enough to sound like a genuine memory. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Daniel shaking his head slowly. His lawyer scribbled notes, while watching me with a tight expression. But the prosecutor looked satisfied. Every answer I gave seemed to push the narrative further in one direction. And the terrifying part was realizing that people were starting to believe it. If the prosecutor's questions felt like walking down a familiar road, the cross-examination felt like stepping into a minefield. Daniel's lawyer stood up slowly, adjusting his glasses before approaching the podium. He didn't look angry, which somehow made it worse. Calm people ask sharper questions. He started politely. William, you mentioned Daniel seemed irritated earlier that evening. How long before the fight was that? I answered carefully, sticking to the timeline I'd practiced. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Then the questions got more precise. You were drinking that night, correct? Yes. How many drinks? I hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but he noticed. Lawyers notice everything. Would it be fair to say your memory might not be perfect? The courtroom grew quiet again. I shrugged slightly, just like someone unsure of small details might. Maybe not perfect, I said. But I remember the shove. For a moment he just stared at me. Like he was trying to see through the story. But eventually he moved on. And that tiny victory sent a rush of adrenaline straight through me. I thought the hardest part was over once the cross-examination started winding down. Then Daniel spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet sentence to his lawyer that somehow carried across the room. That's not what happened. I wasn't even supposed to react, but I looked over anyway. Daniel wasn't angry. That's what messed with my head. He just looked confused. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. His lawyer leaned closer to him, whispering something I couldn't hear. For a split second, my mind went blank. I suddenly remembered the real moment the fight started, the chaos, the shouting, the way everything blurred together. And I remembered something else too. Daniel hadn't even been the closest person when the first shove happened. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. But by that point it didn't matter. I had already told the story under oath. Changing it now would destroy me. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed silent and waited for the judge to dismiss me from the stand. After my testimony, all I could do was sit in the back of the courtroom and wait. Waiting is its own kind of torture. When you're in the middle of something, adrenaline keeps you moving. But once you're forced to sit still, your mind starts replaying everything. Every sentence I'd said echoed in my head. Did I sound convincing? Did the hesitation about the drinks make me look unreliable? Did anyone notice the moment I glanced at Daniel? The rest of the testimony blurred together. Other witnesses spoke, some supporting pieces of my version, others uncertain about what they'd seen. No one completely contradicted me, but no one fully confirmed it either. Daniel testified too. He insisted he never started the fight. His voice cracked at one point, which made the room feel awkwardly quiet. Listening to him was almost unbearable. Not because I suddenly grew a conscience, but because I realized something terrifying. The entire outcome might depend on which story the jury believed. And one of those stories was a lie I had carefully built. The jury didn't come back immediately. They deliberated for hours, which somehow made everything worse. Every minute stretched out painfully. I walked the hallway outside the courtroom so many times I probably wore a path in the carpet. My lawyer kept telling me to relax, that long deliberations were normal. But all I could think about was the possibility that someone on that jury didn't believe me. Eventually, the bailiff called everyone back in. The room felt heavier than before. Even the sound of chairs scraping the floor seemed louder. Daniel sat perfectly still at the defense table, staring straight ahead. I wondered if he was praying, or just trying not to panic. When the foreperson stood up, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the first words. Then the sentence that mattered reached me clearly. Guilty. There were other words after that, legal explanations, formalities, but they barely registered. All I knew in that moment was simple. I was going home. And Daniel wasn't. When the courtroom started emptying, I stayed seated for a minute longer than everyone else. My legs felt weak, like I'd just run a marathon instead of sitting through a trial. My lawyer leaned over and quietly said, "You're free to go." Free. That word should have felt incredible. For months I'd been terrified of the opposite outcome. Prison. A criminal record that would follow me everywhere. Instead, I walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunlight like nothing had happened. But something had. As I reached the steps outside, I heard voices behind me. Daniel's family? I didn't turn around, but their reactions carried clearly through the air. Disbelief, someone crying, someone asking how this could happen. For a moment I froze. Every instinct told me to just keep walking. So I did. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel. I had escaped the consequences. But the silence inside that car felt heavier than any prison cell I had imagined. Years have passed since that day, and on the surface my life turned out fine. I kept working, moved to a different city, built the kind of routine that makes everything look normal from the outside. But the strange thing about decisions like that is they don't really stay in the past. Sometimes it's small things that bring it back. A news story about a court case. Someone casually talking about telling the truth under oath. Even walking past the courthouse can trigger the memory. And when it comes back clearly. Daniel's confused expression in the courtroom. The quiet way he said, "That's not what happened." The sound of his family reacting when the verdict was read. I don't know what happened to him after that. I never tried to find out. Part of me was afraid to know. If there's any lesson here, it's not some dramatic moral speech. It's simpler than that. A lie can save you in the moment, but it might follow you for the rest of your life.